Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother and sister, welcome back to Islamic Notes channel. The story that afternoon, Steve, an experienced pilot who had flown various planes around the world, was preparing his belongings for a long journey that would take him from America to Indonesia. The sky outside began to turn from bright blue to golden, indicating that the sun was slowly setting behind the horizon. The sound of the bustling city of New York slowly disappeared, replaced by the silence that was typical around the airport. With steady steps, Steve wore his neat pilot's uniform, a sign of pride that had been attached tightly to him for years. A white suit with gold epaulets on the shoulders, a black tie, and a typical pilot hat, all perfectly attached. A black car picked him up in front of the house, and he drove to the airport with his mind full of the long journey and the challenges ahead. Arriving at the airport, the atmosphere began to feel different. The terminal, which was usually crowded with passengers and me, was now a little quieter. There were only a few people busy with their preparations. The sound of the plane's engine, which could be heard from a distance, created an almost calming background. Several ground crew officers were working swiftly to prepare the plane that would take him across the ocean to Indonesia. Steve walked through the large hangar where his private jet was parked. Under the dim twilight, the plane looked so magnificent. The large engines on the sides of its wings glistened, even though they were slightly obscured by the shadow of the twilight. Every part of the plane, from the wings to the tail, seemed full of sophistication and precision. This was Steve's second home, a place where he felt alive and in control of the world. Before entering the cabin, Steve stopped for a moment. He looked at the sky, which was starting to turn reddish-orange, and in the silence of the night that was starting to envelop, there was a strange feeling that came over him. There was something different. Even though this trip was a routine he had done hundreds of times, tonight, for some reason, it felt heavier. He felt a hunch as if the universe was telling him something. Maybe this was just tiredness, he thought, but something in his heart said otherwise. Something he had never felt before. Without being able to explain it, a deeper feeling flowed within him, like there was a call from afar, as if this world was offering an experience that would change everything. Steve took a deep breath, then stepped toward the cockpit of the plane, ready to start the journey that night. But without realizing it, this quiet and mysterious night would be a turning point that would change his life forever. The sound of the plane's jet engine began to be heard, breaking the almost perfect silence of the night. In the cockpit, Steve sat quietly, checking all the instruments in front of him, with his fingers dancing deftly on the control buttons, verifying that everything was working properly. There was a little nervousness, but he immediately dismissed it. Years of experience had taught him to stay focused, even though this time something felt different. For some reason, the feeling still persisted. The private plane he was controlling was quite different from ordinary commercial planes. This was a luxury plane with large seats and wide windows that provided an extraordinary view from a height. There were 5 passengers sitting in the back cabin, including the owner of the plane, a successful businessman from Dubai who seemed busy with business matters on his laptop. "Steve," came the voice of the man in his 50s, Mr. Hallett, through the cockpit intercom. "Is everything ready for takeoff?" Steve turned his head for a moment towards the intercom screen. "All ready, Mr. Hallett. We will soon be heading to the runway," he replied, his voice calm, but with a little tension that could not be hidden. Mr. Hallett smiled behind him, even though it was not clearly visible. "Good. I have an important appointment in Jakarta, and I hope this trip goes smoothly." "Of course, we will arrive safely and on time," replied Steve. The clock showed 7 p.m., and the runway lights began to shine in the distance. Outside the airport, the atmosphere was getting darker, with only street lights and airplane lights illuminating the surroundings. The cool night wind blew slowly, as if welcoming the plane that was ready to take off into the sky. Steve turned the control key, and the plane began to move slowly along the taxiway toward the runway. Occasionally, he heard the sound of instructions from ATC, air traffic control, on the radio communication, making sure that the flight path was safe. Meanwhile, in the rear cabin, there was the sound of casual conversation between passengers, but not too loud. It seemed they preferred to enjoy the comfort of this trip. Steve adjusted the speed of the plane, paying attention to every little detail, checking the engine system. "The compass is stable. The speed is stable," he muttered in a low voice, as if talking to himself, making sure everything was according to plan. Behind him, the sound of the cockpit door opening for a moment broke the silence. A young flight attendant appeared for a moment to say that drinks for passengers were ready. "Sir, all passengers are ready. Would you like me to continue the service?" "Thank you, we will soon take off," Steve answered quickly, indicating that the time was near. The sound of the plane's engine grew louder, and Steve's heart began to beat faster. He stared at the long road that stretched out in front of him, a path that would take the plane across the ocean to Indonesia. Steve moved the throttle lever, and the plane began to accelerate, touching the runway with the power of the roaring engine. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was getting more intense. Only the sound of the engine and short commands coming out of Steve's mouth were heard. He pressed the button to raise the landing gear, and the plane began to lift off the ground, past the runway, and soared into the air smoothly. The wind that had previously felt cool on land had now turned into a thin wind at altitude, as if caressing the body of the plane. The airport lights that had previously been clearly visible were now beginning to fade as the plane climbed into the darkness of the night. In the rear cabin, Mr. Hallett and the other passengers were a little calmer. Even though they were still busy with their respective activities, they all knew that with Steve's undeniable experience, they were in safe hands. Steve looked out through the window at the pitch-black sky. The cockpit began to be decorated with stars. Suddenly, his mind drifted back to the feeling he had felt before. A strong feeling, even though he couldn't explain it. A hunch that somehow made tonight feel more meaningful. But he dismissed it again. This was just a flight, wasn't it? But in his heart, he felt that tonight would bring change. After 4 hours had passed, the plane that was passing in the middle of the night entered international airspace. All the passengers in the rear cabin had fallen asleep soundly, lulled by the comfort of the luxurious private plane. The dim cabin lights added to the calm atmosphere, while the steady sound of the plane's engine was only heard faintly. But in the middle of the hot coffee that had started to cool in his hand, Steve occasionally took a sip, trying to drive away the drowsiness that began to attack. Even though he was used to long flights, he kept his attention on the cockpit instruments, making sure everything went smoothly. Accidents never knew time, and Steve knew very well that, even though his journey seemed calm, alertness was the key to safety. The atmosphere in the cockpit was so quiet, with only the sound of the engine humming in a calming rhythm. The sky outside was so dark, decorated with a sprinkling of twinkling stars. No city lights could be seen from this height, only the vast darkness, so vast and silent. Suddenly, something strangely caught Steve's attention. From a distance, he saw a bright light that slowly descended from the sky. The light was like a series of several clumps of light, glowing down from the clouds as if piercing the darkness of the night with an unusual power. Steve sharpened his eyes. His gaze couldn't take its eyes off the phenomenon. The light did not stop falling, as if from the high sky that was invisible. Something was falling toward the earth with a sense of amazement. Steve tried to analyze what he saw. There was no weather phenomenon that could explain this light. There were no other planes visible nearby, and this plane was flying too high for there to be an object that could reflect light like that. In the cockpit, Steve could only mutter softly, "What is it?" But he could not answer his own question. This phenomenon he had never witnessed before. The light continued to fall, and it seemed brighter and brighter. It was like an angel descending from the sky. He muttered to himself with a deep sense of wonder. What he saw was so heavenly, as if time stopped for a moment, and the world stopped around them at the same time. Nadia, the flight attendant, who had just passed through the cabin aisle, realized something unusual. She looked out the cockpit window, and her eyes were filled with the same light. Nadia quickly faced the door and entered. "Nadia?" Steve stared at her for a moment, still unable to believe what was happening. "What is it, Nadia? Is there a rational explanation for this?" Nadia sighed, then stared at Steve with a serious look. "Tonight is Nisfu Siban," she said softly. "According to Islamic beliefs, The night of Nisfu Siban is a night full of blessings and understanding. On this night, our prayers are answered, which is why many believe that on this night, the sky opens the doors of mercy, and there are many miracles that occur. Steve was still silent, absorbing Nadia's explanation. He saw the lights continue to fall as if they were endless. Steve's heart was increasingly filled with a sense of amazement and feelings that were difficult to express. "Angel," he muttered in his heart, almost in disbelief. Nadia continued, "Many say that the night of Nisfu Siban is a time when Allah gives great blessings. Sometimes there are those who see signs from the sky, like this phenomenon." Steve, who usually thought logically and rationally, felt a sense of calm that he had never felt before. He knew that there was something bigger than just scientific explanation, but here we are, at the height of this plane, and I see the light. Is this really happening? "Sometimes," Nadia said softly, "miracles can't always be explained with logic. Sometimes we just have to believe." Steve looked back out the window. The lights were getting brighter, slowly fading into the darkness of the night. But the feeling they left behind remained overflowing in his heart. A feeling that reminded Steve of something higher, more sacred, something he couldn't hold on to or explain with words. In the silence of the cockpit, only the sound of the plane's engine was heard, and Steve continued to ponder, wondering in his heart, "Is this a sign for me? What is the meaning of the phenomenon I just witnessed?" Nisfu Siban night, a night full of blessings, Nadia had said. Maybe only time can answer those questions. After a long journey that took hours, the plane finally landed safely in Indonesia. Steve sighed in relief. Even though his body felt tired and weary after the long journey, the tropical sunlight that shone on the airport gave a warm impression, different from the cold air he had felt at the height earlier. But even though the trip was over, something bigger still hung in his mind. Last night's experience that he couldn't forget. That night, the phenomenon he witnessed was still clearly etched in his mind. The lights from the sky that seemed to fall endlessly, as if they had something more. Steve, with all his doubts and rationality, still felt confused about what he saw. Why, as an experienced pilot who was used to flying in the silent night sky, had he witnessed something so extraordinary? Was that a sign of what he wanted to convey to him that night? After arriving at the hotel, Steve immediately went to his hotel room to rest. Even though his body was tired, his eyes remained awake. His heart felt restless, and his thoughts continued to spin about the events of that night. What did I actually see, he thought to himself. Why was I chosen to see it? Time passed, and the clock showed 12 noon. Steve sat in the hotel lobby at a simple dining table. The food in front of him did not really attract his attention. Even though the delicious aroma of traditional Indonesian dishes began to arouse his appetite, his heart was still restless. Something disturbed him, and curiosity slowly gripped him. He picked up his cell phone and started searching for information on the internet. He typed the keyword Nisfu Siban and read several articles that appeared. However, even though he found a lot of information, none of it really satisfied his heart. The information felt flat. It couldn't fully explain the feelings he had experienced. He knew there was more than just a scientific explanation or common interpretation. The desire to know more grew stronger, and his heart became even more restless. Nothing is more satisfying than far. His intention was to give someone more knowledgeable. He felt a kind of determination. A peaceful silence enveloped the surrounding environment. The sound of the call to prayer that had just sounded invited peace that soothed the heart. Fresh air entered through the mosque's ventilation, as if rinsing away the anxiety inside Steve. He entered with careful steps, looking around a little awkwardly. Some of the congregation were sitting in the corners of the mosque. Some were solemn in prayer, while others seemed to be chatting casually. Steve approached a mosque imam who was sitting in front of the imam. An old man with a white beard and a face full of calm raised his gaze as Steve approached. "Assalamu alaikum, Imam," Steve greeted carefully, trying to show respect. "Walaikum salam. Is there anything I can help you with, young man?" answered the imam in a soft voice. His eyes were full of concern. Steve hesitated a little, but then he gathered his courage. "Imam, I want to ask you about the night of Nisfu Siban. I saw something strange last night, and I feel something is not normal. I am not a religious person. I am an atheist. But I want to know more about this. What is the meaning of the night of Nisfu Siban? His voice sounded serious, but behind his words there was a deep unease. The Imam smiled softly and invited Steve to sit next to him. Nisfu Siban is a night full of blessings, the Imam said. Tonight is a very special time in the religion of Islam. Our prayers are fast, and Allah opens the door of forgiveness. Many people seek guidance through prayer on this night. The Imam stared at Steve deeply, as if trying to understand what he was feeling. Sometimes signs from the sky, we do not always understand immediately, he said, but it could be a sign that Allah is conveying something to you. Maybe it is His mercy that has descended. Maybe it is a sign for you to seek the truth, to see the world in a different way. Steve was silent for a moment, absorbing the words of the Imam. I began to think there was something greater out there, Steve replied slowly. Maybe this is what is called guidance. The Imam nodded wisely. Guidance is guidance from Allah. Whoever seeks it with a pure heart will be given guidance. This may be the beginning of your spiritual journey. Steve's heart began to calm down. The explanation made him feel more at peace, although the feeling of confusion still enveloped him, but there was a glimmer of belief that began to grow. Is guidance? Maybe this is the beginning of the spiritual journey I had been looking for. A few months later, Steve began to learn more about Islam. He began to read the Quran, delving into the teachings of Islam, and felt a peace he had never felt before. The deeper he studied, the more he felt something filling the void inside him. Finally, one day, Steve stood in front of an Imam, reciting the 2 sentences of the Shahada, and firmly embraced Islam. From that moment on, Steve's life changed. He no longer felt empty. There was a peace flowing within him, something that could not be explained in words. The spiritual experience he had that night on the plane brought about a major change in his life, a change that made him believe that God exists and that His guidance is always present for those who seek it with a sincere heart. Steve is a very experienced pilot, having flown various commercial aircraft for more than 10 years. As a pragmatic and rational person, he never believed in mystical or religious things. For Steve, everything in this world can be explained by science. However, that night, all his beliefs and views would change. On the night of Nisfu Shaban, Steve was on duty flying from New York to Chicago. The weather was clear, and he was at an altitude of 35,000 feet with clear visibility. However, when the plane crossed a quieter area and far from the big city, something unexpected happened. The sky that was previously only filled with stars suddenly changed. Strange sky phenomenon. As the plane crossed the open plains above the Midwest, Steve saw something surprising. In the distance, a very bright blue light suddenly appeared in the night sky. At first, Steve thought it was the light of another plane or a natural phenomenon. However, the closer it got, the clearer and stranger it looked. The light did not move like a star or a plane, but instead circled, creating a complex pattern. Steve, who was trained to remain calm in any situation, began to feel uneasy. He tried to communicate with air traffic control, but no explanation came from the controller. The lights grew brighter, as if dancing in the sky, and even more surprising, a soft voice could be heard in the cockpit, even though there was no active communication system. A calming voice. The voice was not electronic or mechanical, but seemed to come from within him, but he could not explain it. The voice said, "Trust what you do not see, but what you have in your heart." At first, Steve was confused and tried to ignore the voice, but the rotating light grew closer and the voice became clearer, saying the same thing over and over again. At some point, Steve felt as if he was connecting with something greater than himself. An emotion and calmness he had never felt before began to fill his heart. Suddenly, the plane entered an area where the sky darkened again, and the light quickly disappeared. But the feelings left by the incident remained within him. It was like there was a calling in his heart that he had to follow. Shock and the search for meaning. Upon arriving in Chicago, Steve felt trapped in an undefinable feeling. He felt like there was something bigger he had to find, something that would give his life more meaning. He felt that the incident was not just a natural phenomenon, but a spiritual calling that compelled him to seek a deeper truth. After returning home, Steve began to search for an explanation for what he had experienced. He watched documentaries about celestial phenomena and even read a lot about world religions, but nothing really touched his heart. Then one night, he met an old friend who had recently converted to Islam. The friend gave him a small book about Islamic teachings, and without much thought, Steve began to read. What he found in the book was very moving. The concept of the one God, life after death, and the search for deep spiritual truth provided answers to many questions that he had been holding in his heart. One of the verses in the Quran that he read said, "Indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, there are signs for people who understand." The verse reminded him of his experience on the night of Nisfu Sha'ban. Converting to Islam. After weeks of searching, thinking, and absorbing the experience he had, Steve finally decided to say the 2 sentences of the Shahada and embrace Islam. He felt that this was the answer he had been looking for. He felt peaceful and calm, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his heart. The events of that night, which he had previously considered a coincidence or a strange phenomenon, he now realized were a call to open his heart and find deeper guidance. Steve's testimony. Steve began to share his story with his friends, family, and those around him. He talked about how the spiritual experience changed his life and led him to Islam. Steve knew that not everyone would understand his experience, but he didn't care. For him, the most important thing was that he now had a belief that brought peace to his life. "I can't explain logically what I experienced, but I felt it in my heart," Steve said in an interview with local media. "There is something bigger than what we can see and understand. It is a call to find the real truth." Steve now lives his life as a Muslim, and although he still works as a pilot, his faith and experiences have changed his outlook on life, death, and his purpose in this world. Closing. That night of Nisfu Sha'ban was the beginning of Steve's spiritual journey. From a skeptical and rational man, he transformed into a Muslim seeking peace and truth in Islam. The strange celestial phenomena he experienced may remain a mystery to some, but to Steve, it was a clear sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guiding him to the right path. Steve's story is a reminder that sometimes extraordinary experiences can lead to greater changes in our lives, and that every human being has his own spiritual journey to go through.